Yes, everybody who is on in the background, thank you for being on. Of course, mostly we thank Todd and Cassidy for their time today. And the last time I was on a Zoom with Todd, I think I was informing him that he was just the winemaker of the number one wine of the year last December when Dominus won number one. We were on a Zoom at that moment when it got announced, so that was kind of exciting. But I think we'll also have another exciting day today with Todd, and he's going to go through Ulysses 2018 for us. And we'll have some time at the end for questions. We'll do that through the chat. Then also Bob can bring you guys up if you have a question and when you have a question at the end. But as of for right now, Todd, the stage is all yours. And thanks again for the time this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. So I wanted to start at the beginning. And I make wine because of its unique capacity to express emotion. And it expresses that emotion on several planes, not only through our senses, but also because it alters our state of mind. And I believe that the power in a wine to do that comes from wines that express the unique emotion that reflects the emotion that you feel when you're in a vineyard. And so as a winemaker, we have two major objectives. The first one is to observe and be present and preserve and maybe even enhance the vitality of the vineyard where we're making that wine, the vitality of that ecosystem. And then choose varieties and plant them in such a way that those vines enter into complete harmony with the place so that they become the place. And so the fruit of those vines will be really the fruit of the place. As a winemaker, in winemaking, really what we want to do is stay out of the way. Once we've harvested, we want to prevent any obstruction to that expression. An example of that would be over-ripening, over-extraction, or over-oaking. The story of Ulysses starts on a summer day in 2008 in August. And Christian Wex comes to me and tells me he found a vineyard and he'd like me to see it. And I went by myself at the end of an afternoon, about 5 o'clock. And remember, this is after veraison, so just before harvest of 2008. And I walked the vineyard. It's a 35-acre vineyard. It's on the south end of the Oakville Appellation. It's only a mile north of the Dominus vineyard, but in a very similar situation. It's tucked up against the Mayacamas, and it's on an alluvial fan. There's a very gentle slope. And I walked down a road, and the spirit of the place is very unique. There's a quiet power, and there's a true sense of history. You feel like it's been there forever. And so I returned and spoke to Christian, and I said, if we're able to capture that spirit, we'll be able to make a great wine one day. And that's when the work began. And on August 14th, 2008, Christian signed, and we started our work. The first thing to do was to stop irrigation. The vineyard had been irrigated, and that's a unique opportunity. It's not done very often where an established vineyard becomes a dry farm vineyard. And so we would see how that would work out. But there were other things to do. There was a block just behind the old barn on the north side of the property that had just been planted. It was 2 years old, and it was very weak. The vines weren't growing very well. And we dug some holes. We analyzed the root system, and the root system was already J-rooted. The trellis system was relatively vertical, And at the end of the day, as we walked the vineyard, as we're approaching harvest, the 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 grapes were very clearly exposed to the sun a little bit too much. They didn't have enough shade. So we decided to open up, and over the next couple of years, we opened up the canopy on the existing vines so that instead of 8 inches separation, we had 12 to 14 inches of separation. That wasn't either going to be enough, and we discovered that over time. And as we replanted the vineyard in those new blocks that I mentioned, we were inspired by some of the vineyards that were close by up in the hills, and they had a huge canopy, lots of shade, and that shade was not only shading the grapes, but shading the ground. It was a cooler environment during ripening. And so we decided to mimic that in the best way we could. So we installed a 2-foot cross arm and a Lear installation that would give us a sort of tunnel effect and provide shade for slow ripening of the grapes. On the eastern part of the ranch, there was quite a bit of Merlot planted. And as we watched that develop over a few years, it never got the complexity that we wanted. It never achieved the subtleties that we were looking for. And so we decided to replant that. And while most of the vineyard was planted in Cabernet Sauvignon, there was a little bit of Sangiovese that we harvested and that I made for the first and only time in my life. A little bit of Syrah, which we studied for a few years, tried to understand its expression in that particular vineyard. And we decided finally that those 2 varieties were really not best suited to that vineyard. So we started to replant in Cabernet Sauvignon primarily for about 90%, and we added Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot, which weren't planted when we started the project in 2008. And the vineyards, some of the vineyards that were established, there are 3 blocks, A, B, and C. They're on the southwestern side of the ranch. And those are on rocky soils, and those produced for years beautiful wines, beautiful, subtle aromas, very distinct, and a sort of lacy, beautiful tannic structure. And we knew that those were going to be ideal blocks in the future. What dry farming does is it encourages the roots, it really forces the roots to grow deep into the soil to look for water and minerals where they can be found, because you're not supplying water to the surface. And so over time, some of those blocks that had been established were able to reach a little bit deeper. But finally, we realized that after a certain threshold of time, you can't really find the same depth of connection from vines that have been established on irrigation as you can on vines that are planted with the intention and from the beginning as a dry farm vineyard. And so we've ended up since 2008 by completely replanting the entire vineyard. And today it's been 100% replanted. But in our concept of linking the vines to the place. 2012 was our first vintage that we decided we would release. It was a good vintage, but a rainy vintage, a rainy spring, and quite a late vintage too. And since then, we've understood more and more the expression of Ulysses. There are a couple of other things that have happened that I think are important to note. And the first is that in 2021, we became certified organic. And that was a real process. While we were we considered ourselves organic for many, many years. We gave ourselves the challenge of applying for certification and made some of the additional tweaks that we hadn't paid attention to, like requiring of our suppliers to provide organic material for cover crops, for example. So in an organic vineyard, everything, including the seeds of cover crop, have to be organic. And so we're quite proud of that, and that's from 2021. And the other is a certification in sustainability. Sustainability, while it's not very well understood, it's very important to understand that it's, first of all, a process, that you never arrive, that sustainability is a constant work, and it involves really three things: observation, measuring, and a readjustment of goals and objectives, so that as you measure water use, energy use, you set a goal and you constantly improve upon those objectives. And sustainability really involves 6 pillars, and they're very important. You have to cover each of the pillars to be sustainable: water efficiency, waste management, energy efficiency, pesticide reduction, soil health, so regenerative farming, and an element that's really fundamental, which is social equity, inclusion, and diversity. And that last pillar was sort of unexpected for us, and it was new to us as a concept, but really rich, because when your employees feel like they're contributing and feel like they are in a rich environment, the human ecosystem, which is such an important part of the puzzle, when that's thriving, you can't imagine the effect on our connection to our vineyard and our understanding of the vineyard through the human element. So that's been a journey for us. And we're working, we've just applied for we've just been audited for our certification of Napa Green Vineyard, which is one of the most robust sustainability certifications that exist in the wine industry. So we're proud of that, and we're waiting for the result this week. What makes a vintage, what conditions of a vintage increase a vine's connection to the place, so that the wine that's made from that vintage reflects even more intensely, more powerfully, the spirit of the place? Let's look at the 2018 vintage. 2 key components: precipitation and temperature. And of course, in a dry summer climate, our rainfall falls from October to April, essentially. And we get about 30, 31 inches on an average year. But how that rainfall and when that rainfall comes is extraordinarily important to how the vines develop. And in 2018, it was very unique, somewhat rare. We got most of our rain very early on in the season. We got in November 4.6 inches, which is much higher than the 2 inches of average that we normally get. December was very dry, so that water that fell was able to percolate into the soil, and the soils were able to drain quite a bit. Then in January, 5 inches. February was dry once again, so we were able to get the water that we needed to stimulate the growth of our microorganisms in the soil and break down the organic matter. Through mineralization, that organic matter provides all of the minerals necessary for the vines to thrive throughout the season. But that was relatively early on. February was dry. March was quite rainy. We had 8 inches of rain, but that fell on relatively dry soils because February was quite dry. And then April was 2.8 inches, which is a little bit higher than average. But once again, it fell on soils that were not saturated because of that fluctuation of rainfall that we had throughout the season. So the total rainfall was about 22 inches, less than the 31 inches that we normally get. So we had less rainfall for the season, but the way it fell was very, very important. It stimulated microbiological activity within the soil and didn't come too late. So when the vines started to grow in April, they weren't in saturated soils. They were growing in well-drained soils. So the canopy, while it was medium growth, let's say, it wasn't overly luxuriant. And then we had very consistently warm temperatures until August. And that's key because at the end of July, when veraison happens, we have the transformation of color of the grapes. That's when the grapes start to become very sensitive. That's when they start ripening. And that's where we want to be very careful about temperature. And the temperature dropped in August. It was quite cool. It was foggy. It was sort of a typical Napa climate, which doesn't happen every year. And so we had very, very slow ripening throughout August and into September. And the entire season had been late. So we had late bud break, we had late flowering and bloom, we had late veraison. And so we're on a late year. And so now we're at the end of September, arriving at the beginning of October, and we start harvest. We start with Cabernet Franc. And we harvest on October 1st, and it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Very subtle, very harmonious. And then we have a rainfall on October 2nd and 3rd. And it was a fairly large rainfall. We had 1.5 inches. And everything got cold, including our spirits. I have to say, we tasted throughout that week, and everything seemed to stop. Nothing seemed very hopeful. And we waited. I remember a phone call to Christian explaining the vintage, and he said, wait, give yourself a week after a rainfall and everything will be perfect. We weren't too confident about that, but so we had started harvest on Monday. We got a rainfall on Tuesday, and now we're on Friday, and this is the beginning of October. At the beginning of October, we often have these strange eastern winds that come through, and they're hot and they're dry, and that's what we started to have. And it's sort of fire weather, so not always a good sign. But given that we had had the rains, these hot, dry winds dried everything up, and everything seemed to shift. And on Monday of the following week, we started harvest again, and it was absolutely beautiful. In fact, if I would have never asked for that profile, meaning that climate profile, but we think it was probably key to have that rain, that cold week of cold, and then that sort of dry heat. It seemed almost magical. And from then on, we harvested very quickly, and the harvest was absolutely beautiful. So 2018 is really 10 years after we purchased the vineyard and started our work, started the shifts and all of those tweaks, so that the vineyard today feels very much in harmony with the place. we think it's the, let's see, how do I say this? The most harmonious Ulysses we've ever produced. The Ulysses that has the greatest depth, that has the most, that's able to reflect the serenity and power of the vineyard, but in a quiet way. And I think it does that. I don't know, have any of you tasted, John, have you tasted the 2018 vintage yet with your teams?
Kath, we did send it out already. Everybody got samples?
Okay, so if any of you have tasted it, I'd be curious to see what your comments are. But it's truly, I think it represents, this vintage represents a shift in the wine's reflection of the vineyard. And I think from here on out, and what's interesting about this time frame is that, and as I've mentioned, the entire vineyard's been replanted. So we're looking at a young vineyard. But I've said in the past, and maybe some of you remember, after 8 years, a vine finishes its growth and depth into the soil. Doesn't mean that the roots have stopped growing, but they have basically reached their maximum depth. And it's an age for me in vines where I recognize a real shift in their capacity to translate a certain stability and serenity. And this vintage, which is made from a lot of 8, 9-year-old vines, I think we're starting to sense that quiet power and stability, and they're out of adolescence and now are starting, they're arriving to adulthood in some way.
Tod, could you talk to them a little bit about the cooperage and what you're doing with neutral versus new oak with Ulysses?
Yeah, sure. So we've always believed that oak's primary role in winemaking is to reinforce the characteristics of a wine and to not overpower or it's not an we're not trying to provide additional aromas. We're just trying to support the aromas that are there. So we always use less oak than what you might imagine for a wine like this. We use about 40% new oak. And what's maybe even more important is that the new oak that we use, we always treat it in such a way that it becomes more neutral, and it doesn't contribute so much aromatically because we steam those barrels and we rinse them to remove all of that kind of initial oakiness. And that's a process that is systematic for us. So there's 40% new oak and 60% oak that's either once or twice used previously.
So, Tod, thank you. It was great. I think it was particularly good that you started at the beginning. We have some new team members that you may not have had a chance to listen to your presentation in the past. So thank you for that. Taste of the wine yet? If so, just raise your hand in the comments and we'll get them in. It looks like Paul Brown.
Hi, Tod. Good to see you. Thanks for making time. When Mark and I were out there last summer, we had a chance to taste the 18. And even then, I remember it really stood out. And I was just noticing when I was taking notes when you were talking, and you talked about after 8 years, the wine getting out of that adolescent period. And just going back to my notes and my recollection of how the 18 was showing even last summer, do you feel that 8-year adolescent period that's ended is going to be more of a qualitative increase in the wine, or do you feel it's going to be more of a stylistic profile change to the wine that we should be looking for future vintages?
Yeah, so let me clarify. 8 years, I've noticed a threshold that is a threshold for vines to start. They've finished their primary growth and they're better. First of all, there's a lot of things going on. They're accessing the horizons that are available to them, which includes the water and the minerals that are available in those horizons. And so they're more connected to the place, which means they're better expressing the place. It doesn't represent a shift in style per se, but a greater depth of expression of the place, because they've explored more of the place underground. Over time, from the 8-year point, those roots are going to be branching out and maybe not exploring greater depth, maybe slightly more, but greater, they're going to be filling in between themselves. So they'll continue to be anchored. And what we see beyond the 8 years is a greater sense of groundedness and stability and reverberation that's very powerful. And when I say powerful, I mean in the sort of quiet strength way. So it's not a question of a change of style. It's a question of greater focus and greater resonance. You should be able in the 2018 to better understand the vineyard, better feel the vineyard, because the emotions that are expressed will be more centered and more focused. I think I'm repeating myself.
Can I pipe in really quickly, because we talk about this all the time here, Paul? Is that when Tod talks about those networks, if you will, of vines and the underground root system, it's almost, if you think about it as a Wi-Fi network, like the greater and more complex that becomes, the clearer the translation of the place in the fruit. And so that decade moment of, 1 decade of farming this vineyard, it really does take that amount of time, right, Tod, to find that honed expression. I
love so there's the idea of network is really how you have to see this thing, because you have a network of roots, but it's not the roots and the soil alone. It's the network of roots with the network of mycorrhizae, which are all of the fungus and all of the other microorganisms in the soil, and they're all connected and they're all communicating. And then you take that in addition to all of the tweaks that we've made to improve the connection of the farming and the vines to the place. And we're talking about being just better riding the wave of this place now. And whereas, like at the beginning of a relationship or the beginning of anything, you're at the beginning of a dance, or the beginning of an understanding of a dance partner, you're figuring out how to move with someone. And that's the same thing. The vines, we're figuring out how to get these vines to better engage and harmonize. And that's what we're seeing reflected in the wine.
Thank you. Good to see you, Cassidy.
Good to see you, Paul.
Thanks, Tod.
Sure.
Thanks, Paul. I guess Joe, Joe's got a question. There he is.
All right.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, Joe.
Good, thanks. Good to see you guys. I look forward to this Zoom when we do it. It's very informative and get great information. So thanks. Really appreciate it. My question's about the vineyards. So correct me if I'm wrong, but when you guys first took over, like you were saying, you had existing vineyard, you manipulated a little bit, and then you said you prefer a dry farm vineyard, start from the beginning being dry farmed as opposed to transitioning one over. So at the beginning, you were manipulating some vineyards and replanting some other vineyards, and then now I guess we're at the point where everything has been planted and we're 100% the new plantings, and everything's about 8 to 10 years old. So it's kind of really exactly what you got exactly what you want to work with. Is that kind of how the evolution has kind of gone for the vineyard?
Yes, I suggested all those things, but that's exactly right. So yes, I talked about what dry farming does to an established vineyard, and while we believe that dry farming the established vineyard that was established on irrigation, we believe we made better wines by dry farming it, and they did remarkably well. So I mean, really, the result, which I hadn't delivered yet, of the experiment of dry farming a vineyard established on irrigation, is you can do it, especially when you have the soils and the situation, the sort of site to permit that. It can be done. However, because of what irrigation does to two primary things, the depth of the roots and to the physiology of the vine, even the wood itself is not the same in an irrigated vineyard, because the wood gets very, the vessels in the wood are very large in an irrigated vineyard, as opposed to a dry farm vineyard where the vessels have to be small to be able to pump through capillarity the small amounts of water that are available in the soil. So you even though we went to dry farming on that established vineyard, you can't change what's already happened. It's like taking a child at 10 years old and saying, okay, we're going to change the way you've been raised. Well, there's some stuff that's been done. And so we felt like it was really necessary, if we wanted the full expression, even though we knew the consequences, which are going through adolescence and childhood of those vines, where you wouldn't get the full expression because you'd need to wait some time, it was worth the investment because we always see long term. So at this point, yes, we're completely dry farmed and we're completely replanted. And we're arriving at that coasting stage where the vines have dug in, and now it's just they're kind of explore and broaden more and more. We hope that's the idea. That's extraordinarily important, that point, because Ulysses has tended to be in the first years very loud, very explosive, and while that can be interesting and fun, I think where we're at now is something that it resonates at a deeper level. So yeah.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, Cassidy.
Thanks, Joe.
Looks like Ray's ready to go.
Todd and Cassidy, well, next is going to be one of our new managers in Northern California, Ray.
Hi, Ray.
Hey guys, I'm your local gal.
I know.
Question. I know we talked a lot about soil. What are the exact soil types of the vineyard?
Yeah. So we're on loams and gravelly loams primarily. They vary slightly depending on where you are in the vineyard. Toward the western side, which is the closer to the hills, the upper side of the ranch, these are much rockier, more gravelly, very well draining soils. And as you move toward the east, the clay content increases so that the soils become a little heavier, a little bit less draining. And in those different areas, we have very different expressions. We tend to express more intense aromatic profile on the more draining soils with very fine tannins. And on the more clay areas, we tend to express darker, and when I say darker aromas, that can be dark fruit, but it could also be tar, and it can be smoky, smoky not in the fire way. And the tannic profile is much more, much darker too, in a way, much more powerful. I wouldn't say, yeah, maybe aggressive, dense,
Broody.
Broody, yeah.
Yeah.
Broody.
Very.
Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
Nope, perfectly. Yep, got it. My soil science professor would be so excited.
Hey, Todd, you might want to share really quickly what Pedro Parra says about the soil horizons.
Well, yeah.
It's just a good one for people to know.
Is, and it's, yeah, I may have used it before, but it's perfect. You know, dry farming allows the roots to go into the depths. And Pedro Parra, who's a geologist, soil specialist in the wine world, he talks about the surface of the soil, which is generally the same throughout all vineyards throughout the world. I mean, you've got a lot of organic matter in that top layer. It's not that diverse between vineyards, and it's full of minerals. It's very rich, and he calls that the McDonald's layer, where if your roots are in that layer, they're getting lots of stuff, but it's not very diverse. And then you go into the plunge into the different horizons, and that's the Michelin star, 3 Michelin star area, where if your vines can access that, that's where all the subtleties, it can be discrete, little variations. It's more poor, meaning less obvious soils, where there's small amounts of minerals, but very, very key to a terroir expression. So yeah, so that's and it's important to be in those deep horizons.